Hi everyone, it's Amanda McKenzie here from the Climate Council. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. You know that the Climate Council is Australia's independent evidence-based climate organisation, and we're so lucky tonight because we have Matt Kean, the Chair of the Climate Authority and former New South Wales Treasurer and Minister for Energy and Environment, joining us tonight. But before I get into his introduction, I just wanted to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I am meeting you on today. So that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge their deep and enduring connection to country. This always was and will be Aboriginal land, and encourage you to put in the chat where you're joining us from today. So just to give you a little bit of context and to welcome Matt, who's very kindly joining us tonight. So you have probably seen Matt in the news over the years, and of course he was Treasurer and Energy Minister in New South Wales. And at that time, he played a key role in driving climate action in New South Wales. In 2020, he delivered the Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap, a 20-year plan for New South Wales energy infrastructure designed to incentivise private investment in renewables. He was also the Energy Minister and Treasurer during the devastating Lismore floods in 2022, which I'll ask him a little bit about. And so he's had that first-hand experience of being in government when the consequences of climate disasters really are hitting home. And of course, Matt's been known not just in the New South Wales government, but also for his strong activities on climate policies across the board. He's been crucial in not just shifting the landscape in New South Wales, but in shaping the national discourse on climate change too. So he is now chairing the Climate Change Authority, a body that is being set up it was set up under the Gillard government actually many years ago now, to provide a critical role in the climate ecosystem of providing frank and fearless advice to the Australian government on climate. So we're definitely going to get into that a little bit too. So tonight we'll be talking about all things climate action. And Matt, just to thank you so much for joining us. I think that you're a little bit of a unicorn on climate. You've got incredible passion and commitment to the cause, but you've also been doing the hard work within government of getting outcomes, building the renewable power system of the future. So it's going to be fantastic hearing from you tonight. So welcome.
I'm so sorry, Amanda, and thank you so much for that warm introduction. And could I just pass on my regards to everyone on the call and join with you in acknowledging country. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Darug people up here in the Hornsby Shire, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm coming from tonight and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And just before we get into it, and without wanting to turn this into the Mutual Appreciation Society, Amanda, could I just acknowledge the incredible role that you've played in this space over a long period of time, both during my time as the New South Wales Treasurer, Energy Minister and Environment Minister, where you were one of the most constructive voices that I dealt with in developing public policy, always pushing us to do more, to go further and faster. And without constructive voices like you just don't get good public policy. And I want to thank you for the important role that you and the Climate Council played in a non-partisan way, just pushing for strong climate action. It really put wind in my sails and motivated me to go harder and be better on this stuff. And I know there's a lot more to do, but I appreciate the continued work of the Climate Council under your leadership, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Matt. That's really kind of you. And so for tonight's conversation, we want to dive into all things climate, energy transition, what's been achieved so far, what needs to happen next. And I know that these issues are very much top of mind for everyone in our community. We've got a federal election coming up where climate is one of many issues on people's minds, but also many in the Climate Council community are still mopping up from extreme weather events over the last few months that were made more extreme and damaging due to climate pollution. Many of those communities experiencing flood after flood after flood. So very conscious that this is absolutely real for people across our community and of course the Australian community. Many people have submitted questions for this webinar. So what we're going to do is trying to pull them all together into a series of questions for Matt. And but I'll also be observing the chat as we go, and our team will be responding to some of the chat as well as me bringing that into the conversation as well. So thank you to the 700 people who are joining us today. It'll also go out on email afterwards so that you can catch up if you want to and send it to your friends. So I wanted to start, Matt, by just getting into a little bit of your personal passion for working on this issue. You've been working wholeheartedly on it now for many years, and I was interested in what sort of has driven you. Did you have an aha moment, or was it something that sort of just grew and grew in your consciousness?
I didn't really have an aha moment, but maybe I could give a bit of context to people about my background. I grew up in northern Sydney. We backed onto the national park, and that was an important part of my childhood and development. It was where we spent a lot of time growing up, and it's one of the reasons I've always been passionate about the environment. One of the first books on climate I read was Tim Flannery's The Weather Makers, and I read that as an 18-year-old, and it had a really big impact on me, just thinking about climate science and what it meant for our environment. And I guess I got elected to Parliament quite young, at 28. And whilst I wasn't a vocal, I guess, environmentalist, it was something that I cared about as the member for Hornsby. It's the Bushland Shire. So that was something that I was passionate about. One of my first acts as a member of Parliament was advocating to upgrade the status of the Barara Valley Regional Park at the time to a national park. So it was one of the first and only national park creations under their new Liberal government. And then in 2019, Premier Berejiklian made me the climate minister. And initially I thought I'd upset her because Malcolm Turnbull had just been torn down as the Prime Minister over the neg. The climate wars were raging inside the coalition. I was one of Gladys's key backers, and I thought she would give me a different portfolio. And I thought when she gave me the climate portfolio, I must have upset her or something. But I'm so glad she did, because it enabled me to really do a deep dive into it, understand the challenges, and start formulating some policy responses from the Conservative side of politics. And that really lit the flame for me, because it was the responsibility I had. That same year, my first child was born, and I was certainly getting deep into the area of public policy. And my son Tom was born in the January of 2020. And I remember walking out of the birthing unit at Hornsby Hospital, and just remember this is just before COVID. And my community, like most of New South Wales, was just shrouded in smoke. And it was just like Armageddon. And I think from that moment, the science and all the evidence and the literature I'd been reading really crystallized in my mind that this is what climate change looks like. And I think maybe it was because I was a new father and I was thinking about my own childhood, and that I didn't want this to be the childhood of my kid or anyone else's children. And I took the view that, well, the good news is we could still do something about it, but we really needed to act and act fast. So I guess that was a long and rambling answer to sort of say these are the things that sort of brought me to where I am today now, in the privileged role of being the chair of the Climate Authority.
Yeah, it's it's an amazing journey when you step it out like that, Matt. And I had a similar experience. We must have been at a similar time reading Tim Flannery's The Weather Makers. I have to tell him that it was so influential on you as well. It's some of these, at the right time, reading some of the material is so powerful. And like you said, that first child thinking about all of this and that moment of the smoke, I think most people would have some very visceral memories of that period in Black Summer where 80% of Australians, witnessed that smoke and were inhaling it. So let's move on to talk a little bit more about the energy conversation. I think for most people, it probably feels a little bit confusing. And we found in a recent study that we did that over 90% of Australians had no idea that Australia is now 40% powered by renewables, that there's actually a huge way to go to educate Australians on how far we've come, let alone understanding that most of our coal-fired generators will actually are slated for closure in the next sort of 15 years. So I wondered if you can talk us through thinking back to your time as the Energy and Environment Minister, making that energy switch for Australia's largest state and economy. How do you think Australia is going in the transition to transforming our energy system? What's working and what you see as the challenges?
Look, now is not the time to be pessimistic about the future when it comes to action on climate change. I know there's plenty of reasons to have concern. I mean, the election of Donald Trump in the United States, some anti climate voices getting a lot of prominence in our own domestic political settings. But I think it's important to reflect on some of the green shoots and the areas that we should be really positive about. And, you know, last year we secured almost half of our electricity as coming from renewables, with 46% supplied in the December quarter in our main power grid. 10 years ago, Labor in opposition pledged to get to 50% renewables in the grid by 2030. And the Abbott government at that time thought it would be too ambitious. Well, we will probably hit 50% in one of the quarters next year and average it by 2026, not in 2025. So the government's present target of 82% renewables in the grid by 2030 is ambitious. But the Clean Energy Council says that the fast rate of new projects winning approval in the December quarter could get us to within range of that goal if the rate can be maintained. So the Climate Change Authority, Amanda, will release a report in May. We're looking at how the grid can accelerate its decarbonisation. We examine how extending the capacity investment scheme beyond 2030 will be a key way to shore up confidence in the sector, and also how regulators and planners can do a better job of smoothing the approvals process, whilst we're also bringing the community along. So it's not revolutionary. And guess what share of new capacity and power generation globally was renewable energy last year? 50%, 60%, perhaps 75%. It was 92.5% according to the International Renewable Energy Action. So the growth rate of those installations last year was a record 15.1%. So Australians, we're not laggards either. We've got 4 million homes of more than a third with rooftop solar. There's huge scope for commercial industrial sites to carry the load for future expansion in small-scale solar rollouts. And batteries offer us new ways to tap Australia's abundant sunshine, the envy of beach lovers and also renewable energy advocates everywhere. The International Energy Agency says battery prices have dropped 75% since 2015, and few analysts expect anything but further falls. Last week, I was in the Hunter Valley, Amanda, looking at flow batteries using low-cost non-lithium materials at Allegro Energy. So innovators are going to surprise us with new ways to cut emissions, and we should support them where we can. So there's so many reasons to be positive. There's a lot happening. We've got more to do, but I think we focus a lot on the negatives. But this transition is happening whether Barnaby Joyce likes it or not, and that's just the reality. So I think there's a lot of great things happening. And my role as the Climate Authority Chair is to continue to identify any roadblocks to this transition and make recommendations to government about how we can accelerate things, not just for the benefit of the environment, but this will actually benefit our economy and will also benefit mums and dads and businesses around the country with lower energy bills. And that can only be a good thing.
It's pretty amazing when you look back at how far we've come, isn't it? Like that time when we were both reading the Weather Makers, there was probably about a few thousand homes with panels on the roof. And now we're at these 4 million number, which is just astounding when you think back to it's not a long period of time for such a transition to have happened. I wondered if you had a favorite project or a project that you looked at and thought, wow, the transition's really here. I remember traveling to South Australia about 7 years ago and seeing the solar arrays in the Flinders Ranges, so about 600,000 panels sort of sparkling in the desert, and thought, oh, wow, this is what the transition's going to look like. I wondered if you had a favourite project in New South Wales.
Uh, my favorite project is actually every time I'm driving to work or walking around my local streets and I see every second or third house with solar panels on their roof. It's been this quiet revolution. It's not of greenies, it's not of activists, it's just normal people in the suburbs that recognize that clean energy is also cheap energy. And again, they've put solar panels on their roof, not because they're trying to make a political statement, but because they know that they will lower their bills.
Mm.
And we've got the highest penetration of rooftop solar in the world, and nothing says to me that clean energy is the way forward more than this revolution that has taken Australia by storm, and that's solar panels on roofs. And when we get batteries that can be put behind the meter, I mean, we know that coming down the cost curve, when you supplement those solar panels on roofs with batteries in the home or in the community, it means that we'll be able to take that cheap power in the middle of the day and power our homes and businesses in the night. So those people talking about waiting 20 years for nuclear energy, I mean, they're basically betting that innovation technology around renewables won't get better. And that's a really dumb bet.
Yeah, if you just look back on the last 15 years, it makes it a really dumb bet, doesn't it? I wanted to bring us into there's often a story about how the economy environment are in conflict, when of course a prosperous economy is dependent on a stable climate, a healthy environment. And you saw this directly during, I mentioned earlier, the Lismore floods, when you're treasurer and you suddenly see a big hole in the budget. How can we take on that challenge of trying to craft the climate story into an economic lens?
I don't think we really need to craft it into an economic lens. It is like we aren't doing these things because it makes economic sense to do so. And I mean, I'll just start on that point that you mentioned. I was the Treasurer of New South Wales and I had to fund the most expensive natural disaster the state had ever seen, and that was the Lismore floods. And that followed the worst bushfires that we'd ever seen, and the cost of that was enormous, not just the cost on the financials of the state, but the cost of rebuilding lives and livelihoods. And that followed the worst drought, the most expensive drought that New South Wales had ever seen. So to those people that say taking action on climate change is too expensive, well, let me tell you, I've seen the cost of us not taking action on climate change. And let me tell you, it dwarfs the cost of action. So that's the first point. And, when it comes to responsible economic management. Responsible economics is about risk management. Do I face a new competitor about to take away my business? And do I face the chance of increasing perils, such as from wilder weather, worse floods or bushfires or windstorms? Those increased risks are showing up in our insurance premiums, whether for homeowners or business owners. The demand for action on climate, whether to cut emissions or to fortify our communities against the worsening threats, isn't something limited to our election cycle or those overseas, and that demand will only continue to grow. So it'd be irresponsible for us not to take strong action, but we're not just talking about bracing for what's ahead, but rather embracing the low carbon technologies that are already competitive with dirty ones or will be soon. Embracing the industries that will provide well-paid and psychologically rewarding jobs, embracing the protection of what we hold dear, our amazing natural world, for the generations that will follow us. So this is one of those rare opportunities where being good for the environment also makes economic sense. And let me put it into perspective for those on the Zoom. Australia is a small open market economy, and our prosperity for generations has been underwritten by us trading our goods and services with the rest of the world. And the markets that have underwritten our prosperity for generations are looking for different products to power their economies. Clean products. Think Japan and Korea. I've met with their senior leaders, and they've said to me, notwithstanding what's happened in the White House, we're going to continue on this path because it makes economic sense for us to do so. So, as I used to tell my friends in the coalition, you don't need to believe in climate change to believe in capitalism. Investing, creating the new industries that the rest of the world is looking to power their economies and create jobs and opportunities means investment in Australia, it means jobs in Australia, and it means economic prosperity for Australia. And I'm just arguing that we should embrace that and hand our planet to our kids better than we found it. I think it makes sense on every level.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you find total agreement here, Matt, as you'd be surprised to find. Yeah, I think one of the frustrations that I consistently have is around this phrase like climate inaction, as if it's just negligence, but it's an active decision to have polluting policies that will lead us down a track to more extreme weather events, and also to fail to embrace these other industries that can take us into the 21st century and ensure that when people are not buying our coal and they're not buying our gas, that we have a range of other industries that we can be exporting. I wondered if you could take our minds into the future, say the 2035, 2040, and sort of try and describe what Australia feels like when we are in this place where we have substantially tackled climate change and some of those industries are coming to fruition.
Well, I think the vision is very clear. It's a better environment for our kids and their kids and their kids, but it's also a more prosperous economy. It's an economy with sustainable jobs. It's an economy with sustainable industries, and it's an economy that will leave future generations more prosperous than any generation before them could have imagined. I mean, the natural advantages that have underwritten our prosperity for generations, whether it be the things we dig out of the ground or our location on the map, they are not things of the past. They will be things of the future, but just different things we're pulling out of the ground. Rare earths, precious metals that will provide the storage to power our cars and our batteries and things like that. But there are new natural advantages in the net zero world, and that is something that we also have an abundance of: wind and solar, and a lot of low densely populated land. That enables us to produce energy at some of the lowest costs anywhere in the world. And if you can get a competitive advantage on energy production, that means you've got a competitive advantage in energy intensive industries, industrial processes, manufacturing. They're things that densely populated countries or continents won't be able to do. That's why Japan, Korea, the Asias will be looking to countries like Australia or the Middle East. And there's an international arms race underway to grab those jobs and that economic prosperity of the future. And if we stick our head in the sand, let me tell you, the Middle East will grab them, other countries will grab them. And I
Yeah.
think that's too big a chance for us to pass up.
And yeah, and again, looking backwards, this 20th century prosperity was built on fossil fuels, and that won't be the prosperity of the 21st century. So energy will underpin prosperity, but it will be clean energy. And Australia, as you say, has such enormous opportunities. I think often what people yearn for in this space, and probably many public policy spaces, is to see politicians from all sides working together. And in your political career, you made significant progress on climate action by bringing people from different sides of politics together, including for the renewable energy roadmap for New South Wales. And it made headlines at the time, sort of a shock that Liberals and Nationals would be working together together for renewable projects. But of course, as you've been articulating, there were huge benefits for the community and for regional communities in particular. I wondered what lessons you learnt from that experience of finding common ground on the issue and what lessons we can take away from that in the future.
Well, maybe if I just start by talking about why the Climate Council is so important, because it is non-political in the sense of it welcomes people of all political persuasions and none. And I think that's why you're such a trusted voice to governments. And I guess when I was the energy minister, I didn't see myself as only representing a political interest. I saw my role was to represent the state's interests. And I think when you want to deliver public policy that's durable for the long term, you need to build coalitions. And I think we've lost a bit of the art of trying to work across the aisle and not divide on our politics, but trying to find that common ground. So my lesson, the lesson I took out of that process was that there are some fights and things that we can disagree on respectfully, but there are some things that we need to work together on to achieve outcomes. And I think protecting our planet and growing our economy at the same time is one of those things. So that was the starting principle. And then we worked with, I mean, in my party, the Liberal Party is very diverse. It's got inner city moderates like me and outer suburban conservatives. And then on top of that, you've got the National Party representing regional communities. So we didn't try and, sort of not include them in the conversation. We brought them to the table and tried to understand what was motivating their views. What did they want? And I was fortunate to have a leader of the National Party, a guy called John Barilaro, who might be known to some of your viewers tonight. And John was one of the colourful people in New South Wales politics. And let me tell you, he was a passionate guy, but he understood what his communities wanted. And that was jobs, that was investment, that was opportunities, regional renewal. And so we worked with him to design a policy suite that would accommodate the bush and bring them the prosperity that was on offer. We worked with Conservatives in the Liberal Party, and we understood what was driving them. Then we reached across the aisle and worked with the Labor Party. And to their credit, they came with good intentions to try and find a way forward. We worked with the Indies, the Greens. Everyone in the Parliament came on board to support the legislation, apart from Mark Latham. And quite frankly, if Mark Latham doesn't like it, it shows you how good the policy was. So I think there's a lot to be said about our political leaders acting in the national interest or in the state's interests, rather than just their political interests, if we want to get durable policy for the long term. And that's something that I tried to do. And sometimes you weren't able to find that common ground, but I think this one was way too important not to try and get there, which I'm pleased in New South Wales we did. And this was a policy that we legislated in 2021, I think, or 2020, but it's already survived a political cycle. And that means that investors can have confidence to go ahead and build that renewable energy. People know the direction that we're travelling in. It's not going to be stymied by a change in government. It's going to be enduring and hopefully set our state up for even greater success in the future.
Mm. And I recall that time with you in that portfolio in the New South Wales government as an easing of polarisation on climate between the major parties at a state level. But of course, the polarisation at a federal level continues and climate remains a political football. We're releasing our assessment of all political players' performance on climate change over the last federal term on Thursday. So the ALP, Coalition Greens and the community independents who were elected with clear climate mandates. So to the community, look out for that. It's, I think, a really valuable piece of discourse in the lead up to the federal election. But of course, there is quite a distinction between what has happened in the New South Wales government and what is going on federally. And I want us to take a bit of a change of tack now, Matt, to look at some of the obstacles to tackling the climate crisis. And you've been quite outspoken on the nuclear issue. And of course, Peter Dutton has promised to build a nuclear industry in Australia. The CCA recently completed a very comprehensive assessment of the proposal, and I wondered if you can unpack it for us and what it means for climate pollution and how it stacks up economically.
Yeah, I sure can. And maybe if I could just preface my remarks by saying that politics should be left to the politicians, and the Climate Change Authority is independent and non-partisan. And to those that are criticising the frank and fearless advice that I'm providing as the Climate Authority Chair, well, if you don't like the facts on nuclear, get better policies. So I think that we should defer to the experts, though, as such as Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Their latest nuclear market report, out on Monday, noted that there remains a lot of excitement about nuclear energy prospects. However, apart from plants being built in China and India, the outlook is for nuclear is not matching the hype. That's just the reality. There are no, and I'll quote, there are no reactors are under construction in North America, and projects in Europe are moving slowly. That's not me saying that, that's Bloomberg New Energy Finance. These are regions with established nuclear industries, and even there, the going can be glacial. NuScale was trying to build a 50 megawatt or very small modular nuclear reactor in the US had to spend 500 million, that's Aussie 800 million, on regulatory fees alone. So another one pitching these 50 megawatt reactors is a firm, unfortunately, if aptly named, Last Energy. China can build reactors in 7 years or fewer and have almost half the world's nuclear reactors under construction. That's 28 of them. So far, China has only focused on its home market. But that build is being dwarfed by the installation of renewables around the world. So let me just put a few facts on the table for everyone. In the New South Wales context, the advice that I was given by the Energy Secretary when I first came into the role is that by 2030, they expected 4 of the state's coal-fired generators to be out of operation. That's at the time, that's back in advice I received in 2020. So that's not because of climate change. That's because of the economics of these things are being undermined by other technologies. And secondly, they're old bits of machinery that are coming to end of life and they need to be replaced. Now, if those 4 power stations in the New South Wales context are out of the grid by 2030 and you're betting on nuclear to replace them, the likelihood of being able to deliver nuclear in 10 years is near on impossible. It would be a first of its kind build here in Australia. We have no regulatory regime to be able to manage it. We don't know how to do the waste. We don't have a workforce that is scaled up to be able to build these things, let alone run them. There are so many barriers to this that, again, if you're betting your energy policy on nuclear, hi Tom, sorry, my 5-year-old has just come to say hello. If you're betting your energy policy on nuclear in the context of aging and less reliable coal-fired power stations coming out of the system sooner than we anticipated, you're basically exposing citizens of this country to a less reliable energy system with more costly energy. And I just think that makes no sense whatsoever. When you look at the counterfactual, where you can get capacity installed in the system today, that also has the added benefit of being clean and also driving down power bills, I do not know why you would not do it.
Mm. And the CCA also looked, of course, at the emissions profile of if nuclear takes years and years and years, as you're saying, to come online, what would be the consequence for our climate pollution? And could you elaborate a little bit on what that would mean?
Yeah, the Climate Change Authority looked at, and let me just make it very clear for those on this call. At this election, there is a clear fork in the road when it comes to energy policy and when it comes to climate policy and the emissions that we sent into the atmosphere. Under one pathway, the current government is following AEMO's integrated system plan, which is effectively replacing retiring coal-fired power stations with a combination of renewables, storage, firming, and also transmission. The Climate Change Authority looked at that pathway compared to the pathway set out by Frontier Economics, looking at nuclear. And what we found is that not only would we not achieve our 2030 target of 43% emissions reduction on 2005 levels by 2030, we would miss the 43% emissions reduction target by 2035. And it would be unlikely that you would decarbonise the electricity system until 2048. And what that means is that you're only decarbonising 35% of the emissions from our economy and making it very hard for the rest of the economy to decarbonise or to get to net zero by 2050. What we also found is that you would be requiring aging coal-fired power stations to be running the system. And these aging, just because you extend them doesn't make them more reliable. So you're exposing consumers to a less reliable energy system. That means eye-wateringly high bills and the likelihood of more blackouts into the system. So putting that aside, if you're just looking at emissions, the Climate Change Authority looked at the different pathways and their impact on atmospheric emissions, and we found that there would be an additional 2 billion tonnes of emissions belched into the atmosphere by 2050 if you were to go down the Frontier Economics pathway model. That means the equivalent of a 2 billion tonne carbon emissions bomb being dropped into the atmosphere, the equivalent of 200 years of our aviation emissions. So that is a clear difference in approach being put forward by the major parties. Now, we've put that information out there. We'll let people make up their own mind, but clearly it would make it very difficult to get net zero by 2050 under the nuclear pathway being proposed by Frontier Economics.
Mm. Thanks, Matt. That was a really comprehensive answer, and I saw comments coming through, people really appreciating the level of detail that the Climate Authority has provided. And as you've said, the nuclear policy suggests enormously greater climate pollution in the years ahead, as well as the costs and the timeframe that would be very extensive. It was interesting in the budget reply that there was $0 for nuclear listed there. So it does seem like potentially there has been a cooling inside the federal coalition, which I won't ask you about, Matt, because you are in the public servant realm now, as you said. But there has, I suppose, been a significant emphasis in the public discussion recently around gas. And of course, Australia is one of the largest exporters of gas in the world, and gas is a substantial contributor to the climate crisis. We argue at the Climate Council that there is a declining role for gas in the years ahead, and we don't need any new gas infrastructure. We can use the gas we have currently available to do some of the things that are required in the transition, but a declining role over time. And I saw you speak at the Australian Financial Review conference recently, and you talked about how the role of gas is sometimes misunderstood because, of course, you couldn't simply just substitute in gas for coal. They have different roles in the energy system. I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on that and what is the relative cost of gas to renewables?
Well, let me be very clear. Gas is going to play a small but important role in this energy transition, and that's been laid out by AEMO in their ISP. We're going to need peaking gas, not baseload gas, peaking gas, to be able to support the high penetration of renewables into the system. That will unlock a high penetration of renewables into the system. So that's the first thing that I'd say. We'll take a pragmatic approach because we need to ensure that we keep the lights on, we drive bills down, and the best way to do that is, again, renewables backed up by storage, firming, and transmission. So, with regard to gas in the system, again, we'll follow the advice of the engineers and the experts on this. And what they clearly say is that the cheapest way to modernise our electricity system at law is firmed renewables. It's not nuclear, it's not coal, it's not baseload gas, it's firmed renewables. Again, that's the Climate Change Authority will work with the experts, but let me be very clear. If you want to get high penetration of renewables into the grid, you're going to need peaking gas. But just remember that gas is a very, very expensive way of generating electricity, not as expensive as nuclear. So you want to make sure gas is there as an insurance policy for when we need it, but you want a more renewables intensive grid with the gas there as insurance.
And I think that's the really critical point, isn't it? That it's there as an insurance policy, but you're not using it constantly in the same way that you'd use a coal-fired generator. It's something that you use for short periods, and as we're saying, it will decline in importance over time as we're able to bring on these other forms of storage and firming. So you did mention power bills earlier, and of course, energy bills are a big part of the conversation right now. Can you speak a little bit to what is driving the cost of electricity bills in this country, and what is the role of renewables?
I think we need to deal with a lot of the misinformation around electricity prices in this country. We saw steep increases in electricity bills following Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. That meant that the spot price of gas and coal went through the roof. That's one of the reasons that the then federal government, working in conjunction with the states and territories, sought to dampen coal and gas prices and put a cap on coal and gas across the country. I was the New South Wales Energy Minister at the time, and New South Wales signed up to that initiative because we wanted to protect consumers and businesses. So that has driven the high prices that we've seen in recent times. Now, it has come off significantly since the high point of the invasion in Ukraine, but they are still elevated. The best way to put downward pressure on electricity prices is to get more supply into the system, more cheap supply into the system. And the cheapest form of capacity that we can get into the system is renewables. That's not me saying that, that's the CSIRO saying that, that's AEMO saying that. All the experts say that. Anyone arguing for nuclear energy into the system is arguing for eye-wateringly high electricity bills. And don't take my word for it, take the UK's experience. The UK government is underwriting electricity bills at eye-wateringly high prices for their Hinkley Point C plant. That is the reality. The course for Australia to get the cheapest, cleanest, and most reliable electricity is renewables backed up by firming, storage, and transmission. That is the pathway that's been set out by the engineers and the experts. And rather than ignoring evidence and facts, we should lean into it and get on with it.
It's interesting you bring up the war in the Ukraine as well, because of course Australian gas prices are linked to global gas prices, despite the fact that we're a huge exporter of gas and we have a huge amount of gas in Australia. So we released a report last year looking at cost of living and how both fossil fuels contribute to higher cost of living, gas being one of those aspects linked into global markets, particularly when it's been at its highest point, but also climate disasters fueling higher costs. You mentioned insurance premiums previously. It can also contribute to higher grocery costs if there's been substantial extreme weather events. So I think it's one of those things in the public discussion that's not necessarily as visible the way that this issue is intersecting so clearly with cost of living. But it's also on the solution side too that I think people are probably most familiar with solar panels can reduce the cost for your personal home, but perhaps people are not as familiar with how it runs through the whole system as you're bringing on, as you said, more supply. So it's a really important point that we're trying to get out at this time is how important it is to be bringing on new supply of renewables, the cheapest form of energy in the sunniest country in the world, to be doing that. But it's also about the industries of the future that we talked about a little bit earlier as well. I wanted to kind of go back to the question I asked at the start about what motivates you. You're obviously very determined and you're up for a fight. If anyone's been following your career in the public domain, you've been very passionate about this issue and willing to push it forward. I wondered, in this context where some people are feeling a sense of despair, seeing the climate change around us, a lot of concern about Trump, sort of drill baby drill. What keeps you powering on? What makes you optimistic about the future?
I think what makes me optimistic is that despite the enormity of this challenge, despite what goes around us in global politics, for example, there's so many reasons for hope. I mean, um, on the economic side of things, we don't have to sacrifice our lifestyles in order to cut emissions today because technology has evolved that certainly when it comes to energy production, for example, that can see us get reliable and cheap energy that is also clean. We can keep or improve our comfort while cutting carbon pollution and have more money in our bank accounts in the process. So as I said at the start, we should be embracing this transition, not bracing for it because it's to our advantage. There's no country on the planet better placed to win in a low carbon economy than Australia because we can get our energy prices down to some of the cheapest anywhere in the world. That's an absolute game changer for our country. You know, we missed the last industrial revolution. Let's not miss the next one. And we won't miss it if we lean into the future. We take advantage of our abundant natural resources, our wind and solar, and we get some of the cheapest energy prices anywhere in the world. That'll underwrite our living standards, family household budgets, and industry and our economy. So I'm full of hope. I see examples of it everywhere. I mean, I just want to comment on Trump, for example. Trump, we've seen this show before. In 2017, he pulled out of Paris. He, was denying action on climate change. And that year, the world installed 100 gigawatts of solar capacity. This year, last year, 2024, Trump was elected. The world installed 600 gigawatts of solar capacity, multiple times of wind capacity compared to 2017. Battery capacity is going through the roof. So the capital's made up its mind on these things. They're not doing it because they care just about the environment, which many of them do. They're doing it because it makes economic sense. And this issue, the imperative to take action on climate change, is bigger than one occupant of a political office at a particular point in time. The momentum will continue because the economics make sense and the science requires us to do something. And I'm confident good people of goodwill, like the people on this call, will step up and will do their bit to ensure that we do hand our planet to our kids better than we found it, understanding that in doing so, we can hand our economy stronger and more prosperous than we found it as well.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned in passing through the conversation tonight some of the potential industries for Australia. So the other types of rocks than fossil fuels that we can be taking out of the ground, but also potential manufacturing, whether it's green steel or aluminium. And there's hydrogen, there's potentially exporting renewables overseas. What are the things that, when you look at those opportunities for Australia, what is one of those industries that is really exciting to you about what Australia's role can be in the broader transition of nations to tackle the climate crisis?
Well, I think everything stems from getting cheap, clean, reliable energy into the grid. And if you do that, you underpin a whole range of industries that the rest of the world is going to need. So, speaking to some of our friends in Korea and Japan, they won't be able to get the scale of renewables to get those electricity prices down. So it won't make a lot of sense at the moment to export things like green molecules like hydrogen or green energy up to places like Japan and Korea. But what will make sense is producing the things that those economies are going to need with those clean inputs domestically here. So think steel, think fertilizer, think agricultural products. So rather than producing those things in Asia, producing it here. That means we go up the value chain in what we're producing. Again, seeing Australians get the benefits of this transition right here onshore, seeing jobs, seeing investment, seeing economic growth. No one can do it like Australia. We've got the land mass to do it, we've got the know-how of our people, and we've got an abundance of the resource. So I'm excited about the future. Again, we should be embracing it, not bracing for it, because it's in our economic interest to do the right thing. And we should be leading on taking action on climate change because we're at the forefront of the impacts of extreme weather events. We've got an incentive not just to do our bit, but to lead other countries and encourage them to do their bit as well, because we're the ones on the front lines experiencing firsthand what the scientists have been telling us would happen for decades. So it's absolutely in our interest to take action on climate change and to lead in this space.
Mm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think as we go through, particularly we call it the extreme weather season now over the summer period, I think a lot of Australians now go into that period with some trepidation. And I think we're holding sort of multiple realities at the same time. There is extreme weather events that are getting more destructive, but then we have this enormous opportunity for Australia that we are partway along the way to embracing. I think those points we tried to bring out at the top that, we do have 40% of our power coming from renewables, 4 million homes with panels on the roof. We've already made a substantial amount of progress, but the opportunities are quite abundant when you look into the future. And we think about that sort of 2040, looking back, when it'd be unlikely you'd have a nuclear power station up by then, but you could be looking back at, having made the transition in Australia to renewables and having built a number of these industries that can be fueling us prosperity for the future. So we've run out of time, and I just wanted to close the chat tonight by thanking you, Matt, for your time. You are so eloquent in the way that you discuss these issues, and you're able to get into such depth across the very varied topics that we go into. So thank you so much for going into all of that. I also wanted to thank everyone who's been on the chat. It's been a very vibrant chat tonight. Sorry, I haven't been able to keep across all of it, but the pre-submitted questions as well were super useful in crafting the questions that I've been putting to Matt tonight. There's a lot coming out from the Climate Council in the next few weeks, and to give you a flavour, I mentioned our election report coming out this week. We've got a Climate Choice Awards next week, which is evaluating communities and businesses have been doing a great job around renewables. And then later next month, we've got our Climate Risk Map, which will be coming out that shows the insurance risk for every community across Australia as a consequence of worsening climate change. As you probably know, the Climate Council is a charity, so we bring you these events with the generous support of our donors and supporters. So if you have enjoyed the event, please consider engaging with the work in the future. So you can follow along on socials. You can join as an email subscriber and get more involved in the Climate Council from here. So the first thing would be to receive an email with today's webinar that you can feel free to share with your friends and family. And please also follow us on social. We'll have a cut-up version of this for you as well. So, Matt, we've covered a lot of ground today, and I really appreciate you making the time to join us. And thank you, everyone, for being with us.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone. And could I just thank your amazing chair as well, Carol Schwartz, who is just a living treasure. And
Real
thank you
powerhouse, isn't she?
thank you for the work of the Climate Council. And can I just thank all the members for your passion and interest about this important area of public policy. This is not a red team, blue team, green team, independent team issue. This is all of our issue. And if we get this right, we can again set ourselves up for a more successful and a better future for our kids, their kids, and their kids. And that's a chance that's too big to pass up. So thank you for your leadership, Amanda, and thank you for having me here tonight.
Thanks so much, Matt. And we can get back to those little kids, your Tom and my little two, who are probably waiting for us. I think my two are just finishing their dinner now, the kids that we're sort of building this future for. So thank you everyone for being a part of it, and we'll see you soon.